The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the suburban neighborhood as I sat in my living room, scrolling through my phone, unaware that the quiet evening was about to shatter. It was supposed to be a normal day, peaceful, uneventful, just like any other. My dad, an ordinary man in his 50s, had always been the one to handle the yard work, the fences, and the minor annoyances that came with our HOA rules. But today, as I looked out the window, I saw something that would change everything. Through the haze of the setting sun, I watched as my dad argued with a man, a stranger, someone I'd never seen before. The man, who seemed far too eager to enforce the HOA's petty rules, raised his voice, gesturing wildly at the fence my dad had been fixing. I couldn't make out the words, but I could sense the tension. Suddenly, without warning, the stranger pulled a gun and fired. The shot rang through the quiet evening, loud and sharp, slicing through the air like a knife. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My dad collapsed onto the ground, his body twitching as he fell. The man stood there, watching, as if he had just struck down an ordinary man over a meaningless dispute. My mind raced, questions flooding in. Why? Who was this man? What did my dad do to provoke such a brutal act? But what the shooter didn't know was that my dad wasn't just any man. Growing up, I always looked up to my father, John, in a way that every child looks up to their superhero. He was everything you could want in a father, protective, reliable, and strong. But there was something else about him, something I couldn't quite place. It was the way he never seemed to get tired, how he always had this calm, methodical approach to everything he did, even in the most stressful situations. It was as though nothing rattled him. He'd always be there to fix things around the house, plumbing, electrical work, even those annoying issues with the yard. But it wasn't just his skill set that left me in awe. There was this quiet intensity about him. He rarely spoke of his past, and when he did, it was always vague, nothing specific. When I was younger, I thought it was just normal fatherly secrecy. But as I grew older, those little moments, those oddities began to stand out more. I remember one summer I was about 10 years old, and my dad had just finished fixing our fence after a storm had torn it down. I came out to help him, but as I approached, I noticed something odd. He was carrying an old duffel bag that had been tucked away in the corner of the garage, a bag that I'd never seen him touch before. It wasn't the bag itself that made my stomach churn, but the way he carefully placed it in his truck, as if trying to hide it from view. He didn't explain what was in it, and when I asked, he simply said it was something from the past, a past he didn't elaborate on. Over the years, I came to learn that John wasn't just any regular man. He had skills that seemed out of place for someone who worked in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't just his strength or ability to fix anything. It was his sharpness, his quick reflexes, his ability to remain unervingly calm in the most chaotic situations. When I got older and started looking at things through a more grown-up lens, I began to piece it together. John had a military past. He'd been a sniper in the Marines, a part of a special ops team that dealt with missions no one ever spoke of. His past was buried in a way that it was almost like it didn't exist, but I knew it did. I knew the man who raised me had been a weapon once, and even though he had buried that part of himself, it was still there, locked away in the back of his mind. The neighborhood we lived in was peaceful enough, but it wasn't without its own set of issues. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, was always a source of frustration. They were constantly sending letters, nitpicking every little detail about the appearance of the houses, the color of the fences, and the placement of the mailboxes. It felt like they had nothing better to do than create problems that didn't exist. My dad, however, was always calm about it. He had the demeanor of someone who was used to dealing with more serious things than a bunch of neighborhood rules. Still, he followed the rules mostly. He fixed the fences when they fell, repainted the mailbox when they asked, and followed all their trivial requests, even though I could see the frustration building in him. But that all changed when Rick, the fake HOA agent, came into the picture. He wasn't an official part of the HOA, but claimed to be a contractor hired to enforce their rules. From the moment he walked into our lives, something didn't sit right with me. He was arrogant, almost too eager to prove himself. He had that cocky, entitled attitude, like he believed that because he had a little power, he could do whatever he wanted. At first, he seemed harmless enough. He would walk around, pointing out the smallest issues with the yard or the fence. But there was a tension in the air whenever he showed up, a sense that he wasn't just there to do his job. He was there to make people feel small, to exert his power over them. The first time I saw Rick interact with my dad, I could tell it wasn't going to be a normal exchange. Rick had come to address a violation of the HOA's regulations, something about the height of our fence. It wasn't even a major issue, but Rick treated it like it was the most important thing in the world. John, calm as ever, listened, but I could see the irritation growing in his eyes. There was a brief moment when Rick raised his voice a little too much, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something dangerous in my dad's expression. It was like he was holding something back, but Rick didn't notice. He thought he had the upper hand, but he didn't know who he was dealing with. I didn't know it then, but Rick was about to make a fatal mistake. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my dad wasn't someone to be trifled with. The fence wasn't the issue. The problem was much bigger than that. The day started like any other, but the air felt thicker somehow, charged with a tension that seemed to settle over our house as the sun rose. For the past few weeks, the disputes with the HOA and Rick, the self-appointed enforcer of their so-called rules, had been escalating. It started off with minor issues. Our fence wasn't the exact height they wanted, the lawn wasn't perfectly manicured, and before long, every little thing was scrutinized. At first, we thought it was just another series of complaints that would blow over. But Rick, with his sharp jawline and pompous attitude, made it clear he had bigger plans. He wasn't here to fix problems, he was here to create them. That morning, my dad, John, had gone out to work on the backyard. He was trying to repair the same fence Rick had complained about for the last time. I remember him walking outside with his usual steady gait, his hands in the pockets of his worn jeans. The sun was already scorching, casting long shadows across the yard, but my dad was unbothered, focused on his task. He worked with an ease that suggested he had done this countless times before, fixing things not just in the house, but in his life. But today wasn't going to be like the others. I was sitting by the window when I saw Rick approaching, his boots pounding on the gravel of the driveway. He was alone, but his posture screamed authority, as though he had the entire neighborhood in his pocket. I had seen him on several occasions, and every time, something about him made my skin crawl. But this time, there was something different in the air, a quiet before the storm. My father barely looked up when Rick walked toward him, but I could tell by the slight tension in his shoulders that he knew this wasn't going to end well. "John," Rick said, his voice condescending as always, "you're still working on that fence? It's still not up to standard. You've had more than enough time to fix it." Dad didn't look at him. He just kept working, adjusting the posts with practiced hands. "The fence is fine," he said calmly. "It's just a little repair." Rick wasn't having it. He stepped closer, his face flushed with irritation. "No, it's not. You've been breaking the rules for too long. I told you last time, I'm not going to let this go anymore." I watched, my heart pounding, as Rick's hand reached into his jacket pocket. At first, I thought it was just a threat, a moment of posturing, but then I saw it, a gun, a glint of steel as he pulled it out, pointing it at my dad. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "What the hell are you doing, Rick?" I shouted, but my voice felt muffled, as though the sound couldn't escape the pit of fear in my stomach. Rick's face twisted into a sneer. "You think I'm playing games, John? This is your last warning." I couldn't move. I watched terrified as Rick's finger tightened on the trigger. Everything seemed to slow down. The air, the sounds, the light itself. Time stretched as the cold, metallic click of the safety being removed echoed in my ears. Then, without a second's hesitation, Rick pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the stillness. The sound was deafening, like the world itself had cracked open. My father collapsed to the ground, a heavy thud breaking the silence. My legs felt like jelly, and I rushed forward, but before I could even get close, I heard another sound, Rick's laughter. It wasn't a joyous laugh, but a mocking one, as though he'd just won some kind of victory. I rushed to my dad, panic rising in my chest as I knelt beside him. "Dad, no, please," I stammered, trying to shake him awake. Blood was pooling on the ground beside him, staining the dirt beneath his body. But as I touched his shoulder, a strange thing happened. My dad, John, moved. He groaned softly, lifting his head just enough to look at me. His eyes were unfocused, but there was no panic, no fear. Just calm. "Get away from him, you bastard." I shouted at Rick, but my father reached up with a surprising strength, gripping my arm tightly. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice steady, as if this was just another day at the office. "I'm fine." I didn't understand. How could he be fine? He'd just been shot. The blood was still warm on his shirt, and yet here he was, acting like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. But that's when I saw it. As I looked into his eyes, I saw a flicker of something different, a cold, calculated intensity that I had never noticed before. He was calm, unnervingly calm, as if the bullet that should have killed him was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't just any man I was looking at. My father wasn't some helpless civilian caught in a petty argument. This was a man who had been trained for situations exactly like this. With a swift movement, John stood up, his body a blur of motion. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small, concealed knife from a pocket I hadn't known existed. Rick barely had time to react before my dad was on him, knocking the gun out of his hand with an almost effortless move. The tables had turned, and suddenly Rick, the man who thought he was in control, found himself on the ground, disarmed and terrified. I stood there, mouth agape, as I watched my father subdue the man who had just tried to kill him, all while maintaining the same eerie calmness that I had seen countless times before. But now the truth was undeniable. My dad wasn't just any man. He wasn't some suburban father. He was a man trained for this, a man who had survived much worse than a shooting over a fence. The shock hit me like a wave, and I realized then just how little I really knew about my father. The man who had always been my rock was something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined, and the truth was even darker than I could have ever anticipated. As I dragged my father to safety, panic and disbelief overwhelmed me. The warm blood that soaked his shirt, the bullet wound in his side, and the fact that he was still standing barely left me rattled. I couldn't make sense of it. He was wounded, yet his composure was uncanny, as if nothing had happened at all. My mind raced as I helped him inside, trying to stem the bleeding with a towel, though I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I kept asking him over and over again, "Dad, are you okay? What's going on?" But all he did was offer a reassuring smile, one that made me feel like he wasn't the one in danger. "Don't worry," he said, his voice surprisingly steady for someone who had just been shot. "I've had worse." I didn't understand what he meant by that, and the more I tried to focus on his wound, the more his calm demeanor unsettled me. I didn't know what to do, so I called 911, but even as I waited for the paramedics to arrive, something inside me knew this wasn't an ordinary situation. There was more to this than just a random shooting over a fence. While we waited for help, I heard the faintest sound outside, the sound of a car pulling away. I turned my head to see Rick, the so-called HOA agent, speeding away from our driveway. My father was already watching the scene unfold, his sharp eyes tracking Rick's every move, even though he was still sitting slumped on the couch. It hit me then. Rick thought he had gotten away with it. He believed he had killed John, and now he was on the run, probably thinking he'd be free of any consequences. But as Rick's car disappeared down the street, I saw my dad's face harden, and for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just a matter of protecting his family or getting even, it was something deeper. Something I didn't understand. As the paramedics finally arrived and began to assess the situation, I couldn't help but overhear their conversation. They were stunned by the fact that my dad was still conscious, still so calm. One of the paramedics, an old friend of mine from high school, whispered something to the other one. "You know," she said almost hesitantly, always thought John was more than just a quiet guy around here. There was always something off about him, like he'd seen things, done things. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. What did she mean by that? I could hear the unease in her voice. What was she suggesting? Don't you know? The other paramedic asked. John was a Marine, a sniper. He served in some of the most dangerous places in the world. I've heard rumors from people who knew him back in the day. He was part of an elite team. Some of those guys never came home, and the ones who did, they came back different. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Marine, sniper, elite team. I couldn't breathe. It was like the world shifted on its axis, and everything I thought I knew about my father crumbled. How had I not known this? How had he kept such a monumental part of his life a secret from me, his own son? The paramedics finished their work, and I helped get my dad into the ambulance, still in shock, my mind racing with the new information. But as we drove to the hospital, I couldn't let go of the pieces of the puzzle that were starting to form. The more I thought about it, the more everything started to make sense. The calmness in his eyes when he'd been shot, his ability to take control of a situation with minimal effort, his uncanny ability to assess risks and dangers, it wasn't just instinct. It was training. And not just any training, but military training. Elite sniper training. As we entered the hospital, my mind drifted back to my father's brief glimpses of his past. The bag in the garage, the way he had always seemed to be prepared for anything. I remembered him talking about old friends, his colleagues, but he never went into details. I had always assumed those stories were just casual banter. But now, I realized he wasn't telling me everything because he didn't want me to know. He didn't want me to be a part of that life. As I sat in the hospital waiting room, I felt the weight of the truth bear down on me. The man I had known as my father was not just the quiet, strong, dependable figure I had admired all my life. He was something far more dangerous, a man trained in survival in combat and in the deadly art of precision killing. My mind couldn't stop replaying the events from the day, the way he had effortlessly disabled Rick, the calmness in his eyes as he handled a situation that would have left most people frozen in fear. But the most unsettling part of it all was the realization that he hadn't just been keeping the secret from me. He had been keeping it from the entire world. He had buried his past so deep that no one, not even his own family, had any idea who he truly was. He had chosen to live a life of normalcy to protect us from a world he had left behind. But that world had just resurfaced in the most violent way possible. As my father rested in a hospital bed, I stayed by his side, unable to shake the disbelief that kept swirling in my mind. How had I never known? How had I never seen the signs? And why had he kept this life a secret for so long? But deep down, I understood now. He hadn't wanted me to follow in his footsteps. He hadn't wanted me to become what he had been, a weapon. He had chosen to be a father, a husband, and a protector, leaving the bloodstained past behind. But that past had come back with a vengeance, and I could only wonder what the future held for us now that the truth was out in the open. The story was far from over, and I knew that Rick, thinking he had killed my father, had no idea what he was about to face. The room was thick with tension as John, still recovering from a gunshot wound, stood silently in the shadow of the front door. His face, though pale from the blood loss, held a quiet determination, an unwavering focus that only those who had seen real combat could recognize. The door creaked open, and Rick stepped in, his eyes darting around nervously, still under the impression that he had won. He believed that the bullet he had fired had finished what he started, that John, the unassuming man, was now out of the picture. But little did Rick know, the man standing before him was not the man he thought he had killed. John wasn't just a father, a husband, he was a former Marine sniper, trained to deal with far more dangerous threats than the petty conflicts over fences. You think you've won, Rick? John's voice was calm, controlled. You think this is over? Think again. Rick froze, the air thick with the realization that something was horribly wrong. He had expected fear, maybe a few pleading words, but what he saw was an unshakable presence. John was still standing, and the quiet intensity in his eyes sent a chill down Rick's spine. The arrogance that had marked his every step until now began to falter. "You're crazy if you think you can stop me now," Rick sneered, taking a step forward. His bravado was wearing thin, but he still clung to it. "I shot you. You're done." John didn't flinch. He didn't even move, except to slowly lift his hand to his side, where the bloodstained bandages had been hastily wrapped earlier. His movements were measured, as though he had all the time in the world. "Rick," John said, his voice steady, "you've made a big mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with." The words hung in the air, almost a whisper, but they carried a weight that Rick couldn't ignore. John didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to shout or demand attention. All he had to do was speak, and Rick, the man who had believed he was in control, felt the ground beneath his feet shift. For the first time, the killer instinct in John's eyes was evident, and Rick realized that he had underestimated the man who was standing before him. "You really think this is over?" John continued, his expression shifting into something colder. "You think shooting me was enough to silence me, to make me back down? No, Rick, I'm just getting started." Rick's eyes flickered nervously, and his hand instinctively moved toward his pocket. He was searching for the gun he'd used earlier, the weapon that had brought him to this point. But John was already one step ahead. In a flash, he reached for a small object from his coat, a knife that gleamed in the dim light of the hallway. Rick's hand stilled, the arrogance fading as he finally began to grasp the gravity of the situation. His fingers twitched, but his bravado was slipping away, replaced by something far less certain: fear. "Put it down, Rick," John said, his voice low and steady. "It's over." Rick hesitated, his eyes darting around, trying to find an escape, trying to regain control. But John's presence was overwhelming. Every move he made, every word he spoke, peeled away the layers of Rick's arrogance until all that was left was the raw truth, the truth that he had never truly been in control. The very thing that had kept John alive all these years, the training that had shaped him into the man he was now being brought to bear. It wasn't about violence. It wasn't about revenge. It was about precision, control, and the cold logic of survival. Rick moved again, trying to make a break for it, but John was already there, too fast, too precise. He sidestepped, anticipating Rick's every move. Like a predator tracking its prey, John moved with quiet confidence, always staying just out of reach, always keeping his opponent in his sights. Rick was frantic now, stumbling, desperate to find an opening. But there was none. John was everywhere at once, his movements fluid and calculated, his eyes never leaving Rick for a second. The tension reached its peak as John closed the distance. Rick made one last futile attempt to break free, but John was faster, his trained hands gripping Rick's arm and twisting it behind his back. In one swift motion, John brought Rick to the ground, his knee pressing into the small of his back. Rick gasped for air, trapped beneath the weight of a man who had been trained to take down opponents in an instant, and yet had chosen to show mercy. "Do you know who I am now?" John whispered in his ear, his voice ice cold. "I'm the man who's been keeping you alive, Rick. And now, I'm the man who's going to make sure you never forget who you've messed with." Rick struggled beneath him, but it was useless. He was cornered, outmatched. The adrenaline, the arrogance, the sense of power he had carried with him all this time, all of it had evaporated in the face of John's calm, deadly precision. John finally released Rick, allowing him to stumble back, but not before making it clear that he had complete control over the situation. Rick's hands shook as he struggled to get to his feet, his gaze locked on John, who stood tall, unbothered, and unyielding. "I should have killed you," Rick spat, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. But John only shook his head. "No," he said, his eyes locking onto Rick's. "You're not worth that." John turned away, his back to Rick now, his eyes filled with something deeper than anger. There was no need for violence. He had already won. Rick, defeated and broken, realized just how much of a mistake he had made. This wasn't a game of revenge or power. It was a game of survival, and John had played it better than anyone. As John walked away, leaving Rick to stew in his own fear and humiliation, he glanced over his shoulder, his voice carrying over the silence that followed. "Get out of my neighborhood, Rick, and don't come back." The showdown was over, and John had proven, without a single unnecessary blow, that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one you wield, it's the one you choose not to. The aftermath of the confrontation left an eerie silence hanging over the house. Rick was gone, stumbling away, bruised, defeated, and broken, but the damage had already been done. My father, John, stood there, the same man I had known my whole life, yet in that moment I realized just how little I truly understood him. The calm, unshakable presence he exuded now made sense. The father I thought I knew was only a surface. Beneath that was something deeper, something far more dangerous, something I couldn't have fathomed in my wildest imagination. We didn't speak much after Rick left. There was no need for words. The tension in the air said everything. I helped my father settle back on the couch, his body still weak from the gunshot, but his mind as sharp as ever. He looked at me then, his eyes softening in a way they never had before. There was no apology, no explanation. There didn't need to be. He simply said, "I've always tried to protect you from this part of me. I didn't want you to live with the darkness I carry." But now I saw it all, the weight of the secrets he had kept, the part of him that had been hidden to keep us safe. He didn't want me to become like him, didn't want me to understand the brutal reality of his past. But that past had crept into our lives, forcing us to confront it in the most violent way possible. As the night wore on, I sat there wrestling with my own thoughts. How could I reconcile the man who had taught me right from wrong with the man who had taken lives in a foreign land to protect those he loved? How could I come to terms with the fact that the strength I admired in him was built on a foundation of violence and sacrifice? But there was one thing that became clear. John's power wasn't just in his past. It was in his ability to protect us, to put that past aside for the sake of the family he loved. The man who had once been a weapon had become a shield, standing between us and harm. And in that moment, I realized that the true power lies not in the destruction he could cause, but in the love and protection he offered. For the first time, I truly understood who my father was, not just the man who fixed the fence or mowed the lawn, but the silent protector who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. And as I looked at him now, I knew that no matter what happened next, we would face it together, stronger than ever before. The past was behind us, and the future, though uncertain, was ours to shape. As the dust settles, one thing becomes clear. Sometimes the people we think are ordinary have extraordinary pasts waiting to resurface when they're needed the most. My dad, John, was a man of quiet strength, someone I never truly understood until it was almost too late. He carried a past, one full of sacrifices and secrets, but in the end, it was that very past that saved us all. This story, however, is far from over. The truth is, there are countless untold stories hidden within the walls of every neighborhood, and I'm here to bring them to light. The HOA Stories is just beginning, and we have much more to uncover together. If you found yourself gripped by this journey, if it's made you reflect on your own family, your own heroes, then don't forget to subscribe to the HOA Stories. I promise more emotional and powerful tales are coming your way. And hey, if you know someone who needs to hear this, share the video. Let's build a community of people who understand the true power of family, sacrifice, and resilience. Join us, because the stories you're hearing are only just the beginning. Stay tuned, and remember, sometimes the most unexpected heroes are just waiting for the right moment to show their true colors.